I'm Rio Pacino for podtech.net with another Bearing Point podcast. Joining me is Dan Dron, who is a manager in the FS practice, and he's here to talk about commercial equipment leasing. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much.
Dan, first question for you. What is a lease for those who don't know, and why would somebody lease versus doing a loan?
Well, a lease is simply another form of financing, but depending on the structure, it usually can be accounted for differently. There's several accounting rules and tax validations that have to go into place to really determine if a lease is a true lease or if it needs to be accounted for as a loan. But one of the biggest things that is taken into account is the residual. And a residual is what you pay at the end of the lease. If the residual is considered at the time that you buy the equipment to be cheaper than the fair market value, then it's going to potentially need to be accounted for as a loan rather than a lease because that is considered a bargain purchase option. There are many reasons why a lease is favored as financing over a loan. And some of those that come into play are, one, the monthly payment. Because there is a residual on a lease, then that means inherently that the monthly payment is going to be less. Also, there's usually a lower amount of money that has to be paid to start a lease. You can usually get into the lease for, say, a first payment or maybe a first and last payment, and that's it. So that's maybe only $1,000, $2,000 versus, say, $10,000. Also, at the end of the lease, you, like I said, you have a residual. You have the option to buy the equipment for that residual. You can turn around and refinance on that residual, or you could simply return the asset. And by returning the asset, you are avoiding two things. One, obsolescence. As we know with a computer, usually 3 years after you get it, it's not really up to par. So why keep that computer? Why not go ahead and get another one and be cutting edge? Also, you don't have to be responsible for disposing of the asset. Rather, you return it to the lessor, and then the lessor is responsible for the asset disposition. From an accounting standpoint, a lease can be very advantageous because you don't have to carry it on your balance sheet. It's not an asset, it's not a liability. Rather, it is just an expense line item, just like paying your rent on your building. It's just one expense item per month or whatever that you have to pay. And where this also comes into play is a lot of times when a bank loans you money, they may put covenants into place saying, you have to pay us within X period of time every month. You cannot have liabilities greater than X percent of your equity. Well, if I'm not carrying a lease as an asset or a liability, then I'm not affecting the debt-to-worth ratio, and therefore I am able to get more equipment than I might be able to with the traditional loan. And finally, it comes down to how quick can I get a decision. In this day and age, everybody wants a decision yesterday, and they want it as quickly as possible with a competitive rate. Well, the banks are governed by the FDIC, and as such, they have rules in place where they have to strictly adhere, saying at X dollars, I need to have financial statements. Well, with many leasing companies, they're getting highly competitive, and they will allow an applicant to come in and apply for a transaction for $100,000 or maybe even more, without the need for financial statements. And what this means is they are able to usually get a decision within the same day or a couple of days rather than waiting a week or a couple of weeks that the typical bank is taking to approve a loan. And then also, after the loan or the lease is started, you do not need to sit there and provide updated financial statements on a regular basis unless maybe you're applying for a new transaction. Whereas typically with the bank, you have to provide quarterly updated financials.
Now, Dan, talk about some of the